Hello friends, I am Arpit and I am here with today's analysis. Today is 13th of September and we are into the third day of discussions on the outcomes of the G20 summit recently concluded in New Delhi. This was the 18th summit of G20, first ever hosted by India, and India's presidency has been praised by one and all because India was able to forge a consensus on various issues the world is facing. This particular thing we discussed in the first video, that is 11th of September. Now in yesterday's video, that is 12th of September, we discussed about the Global Biofuels Alliance as well as other outcomes in G20 summit. And in today's session, we're going to discuss two key important aspects or two key important, I would say, events that happened. First is African Union becomes a permanent member of G20 under the presidentship of India. That is the underlining word of this statement. It was India who proposed a full-time membership for African Union and it was accepted by all the existing members of G20. So I would say that we wanted to be the voice of the global south and we have testified it by proposing African Union as a permanent member and finally able to make them a permanent member of G20. So this we'll cover in this topic. We'll see that what African Union is, when was it formed, how it is going to impact positively the African Union, how it is going to impact positively the G20 countries. What is the significance of this inclusion? All these things we'll cover in this particular topic. And finally, the most, I would say, talked about issue since the last year, that is February 2022, is the Russia-Ukraine war. Now we were able to, declare on Russia-Ukraine war also. The Russia-Ukraine war is basically, a major issue in the world right now, which has divided the world in two camps. One camp is the Western world, the G7 countries supporting Ukraine. The other camp is Russia being supported by China. So, where is India? India is in the middle. India is with all. India is promoting Vasudev Kutumbakam. They want to, obviously stop the war. Nobody wants war. And as the statement which has come from our Prime Minister in the past, that this era is not an era of war or this age is not an age of war. This statement has resonated well with everyone. Whether it be the Western camp, that is G7 camp supporting Ukraine, or the Russian camp. But few outcomes which were there and the outcomes which were there in this year's summit were different from last year's summit. Because last year also, November 2022, when the G20 summit happened, the war was going on. The war was on from February 2022. So we're going to discuss the differences, what happened last year, what has happened or what has changed this year. So we will do a comparative analysis over here and we'll see up to what extent it is going to be good or bad. So let's begin with the first topic. African Union becomes a member of G20. Now, let me go back to the last year's summit. Bali 2022, the African Union president walked up to the president of Indonesia, who was hosting last year's summit, and told him or expressed displeasure that you did not keep any concerns of the African Union on the G20 table. Although we are not a member, but our concerns should be kept. We are an important, I would say, geography of the world. Our Prime Minister came to know about it. Our Prime Minister also talked to the chief of African Union last year and he told them that we will voice your concerns. And also guaranteed him that we will make you a permanent member of the G20. This year, under India's presidency, African Union has been made a permanent member of G20. Is G20 now G21? Perhaps yes. African Union, a union of 55 countries, all from Africa. The inclusion of African Union in G20 actually benefits African Union a lot, or Africa as a continent a lot. The much needed finance for infrastructure, climate change, for social sector over there, because a lot of poverty, hunger, disease spreads, all are, intense over there. And it is important to keep their concerns on the table. Now, since African Union will be there on the table, it will be able to keep concerns on the table. Otherwise, before this, only one country from the entire African continent, that is South Africa, was in G20. So it was much needed. India, under its presidency, did that, and hence India truly became the voice of the global South. India also pitched for this thing in the Voice of the Global South Summit, conducted and hosted by India in this year's beginning. So it was clear for India that we have to pitch for African Union's permanent membership in G20. In June this year, July this year, our Prime Minister proposed it to the G20 members. The G20 members unanimously accepted the proposal. September 2023, the 18th G20 summit, we see African Union as a part of G20. And this image, this tight hug, sums it up. This actually was, if you see the video, this actually was a very tight hug, clearly signifying how desperate was African Union to be part of G20. And it was all possible because of the Indian Prime Minister and the Indian diplomats, I would say. So, we announced this, basically our Prime Minister announced this, that in keeping with the sentiment of Sabka Saath, India has proposed that the African Union should be given permanent membership of G20. I believe we all are in agreement on this proposal, said the Indian PM. And then when every member, 19 countries and one EU, gave the nod for it, Mr. S. Jaishankar walked up to the chair of the African Union's chief, escorted him, brought him, and made him sit on his chair. But before sitting on his chair, the chief came to Narendra Modi ji, shook hand. Narendra Modi ji extended his hand to shake hand with him, but after shaking hand, he gave them a tight hug, and this has been captured over here. So this actually was needed. Why it was needed, we'll see in the future slides. But yes, first let us know about African Union, what African Union is. It is a group of 55 countries. Presently 55 countries are there. Some 6 countries are suspended from African Union because of some kind of military coups or political instability in their country, in the respective country. Their governments are responsible for it. So they have been suspended from the African Union. African Union per se, as a, I would say, word, came into existence in 2002. Now, when I say African Union as a word, as an organization came into existence in 2002, does not mean that this kind of organization was not existing before 2002. Actually, in 1963, Organization of African Unity, this organization was founded by the independent states of Africa. What was the aim of this organization? The aim was to promote cooperation between the African states. Cooperation in every sense, political, economic, cultural. every sense cooperation had to be promoted. This was, I would say, a loosely defined aim of this particular organization, that is Organization of African Unity. In 1980, Lagos Plan of Action was adopted. Now, what was Lagos Plan of Action? Basically, Lagos Plan of Action aimed at minimizing reliance upon the Western countries by promoting intra-African trade. Now they specifically started talking about trade with each other. So this deepened or this strengthened the Organization of African Unity. And finally in 2002, the Organization of African Unity was succeeded by the African Union, which had one of its goals to accelerate the economic integration of the continent. Apart from it, other aims of African Union is collaboration in healthcare or social sector. Then, there is one Agenda 2063 which has been adopted by the African Union. Agenda 2063 aims to make Africa vibrant. In other words, I would say that it aims to make Africa a developed country or developed continent. Not country, since it is a continent. So, this is their agenda. When development comes into picture, development is a very broad, I would say, concept. So that is African Union presently. How it is promoting trade? There is a free trade agreement. Free trade agreement is basically a kind of agreement between various parties or two parties minimum, where trade is made competitive by reducing tariffs. Tariffs are import duties and export duties. So that has been signed. They also promote movement of people from one country to the other country with certain restrictions. Now, when I talk about the members of African Union, presently there are 55 members. Okay. The light green ones which you are seeing, that is Guinea, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Sudan. All these are suspended. This Gabon, these 6 are suspended members. Rest all are presently the members. However, there are certain grey zones which you will see. Ascension Islands, St. Helena, Reunion Island. Then we have Mayotte. Socotra is part of Yemen, so not counting it over here. All these are non-members of this African Union. So if a statement comes in UPSC prelims that all the countries in Africa are members of African Union, no, all the countries are not, since they are not. And presently the suspended members are also there. So not considering suspended members, but if we count these islands which are non-members, so we cannot say that all the countries in the African continent which lie in the African continent are part of African Union. No, we cannot say it. Now, when I talk about the significance of inclusion of Africa or African Union in G20, we must understand that African Union, a continent of 1.4 billion people, represented only by a single country, that is South Africa, was underrepresented in G20. The African Union itself was advocating its permanent membership in G20 right from very beginning, or from very long, I would say. And it drew parallels with Europe. Africans, they said that Europe, a continent just like Africa, has 4 or 5 countries who are there in G20 apart from EU also. Whereas Africa, only South Africa and no African Union. So it should be there. Probably that is why the African Union's head last year walked up to the Indonesian president complaining about this. So it is actually making G20 more inclusive by bringing in South Africa or bringing in this African Union on the table. Now, concerns of the African continent will be, kept more, I would say, lucidly, more representatively, in a better way. So it will be making it more inclusive. Second is Africa is one of the fastest growing regions in the world. 4.1% in 2023, the economy is expected to grow, although less than India. But yes, one of the fastest is the word used. Apart from it, other challenges like climate finance or infrastructure development, health security, poverty reduction, all these will also be tackled. So this is actually the significance of inclusion of African Union in G20. Now, benefits for Africa. First is implementation of Agenda 2063. This is there. Agenda 2063 is an agenda which has been rolled out by the African Union itself. That by 2063 we want to make Africa a vibrant continent. To simply put in front of you is they want to make Africa a developed continent. Agenda 2030 is for the SDGs. Now, African Union with its inclusion in G20 will definitely get a push for these two agendas. Next is African Continent Free Trade Agreement. Free Trade Agreement is an agreement between minimum two parties or multilateral parties, or multiple parties can also be there. In this free trade agreement, trade is made more competitive by reducing tariffs. Tariffs is import duty and export duty from one country to the other country when the products are going. So this will get a push. And remember, they wanted to increase trade amongst themselves. Mobilization of climate finance and technology transfer can happen. Climate finance is, I would say, much sought after finance from the developed world by the developing world. Then international financial institutions. Reforms in these international financial institutions can also be more representative. Like, for example, African Union is there in G20, so it can pitch its concerns with respect to the multilateral bodies. So its concerns can also be accommodated while amending or while doing the amendments in multilateral bodies. So this is basically one such thing. Then the much needed infrastructure push can be given to the African continent. It is much needed over there. And finally, investments in the social sector can be seen, like healthcare, education, sanitation. So all these can be looked up to. Now, benefits for the G20 countries. Now, G20 countries can also benefit out of it. It opens avenues for them, new markets for them, new investment places for them to go with their products. And in all domains, agriculture, education, tourism, renewable energy, infrastructure development, all domains are open for them. So, this will definitely be beneficial for G20 countries also. Then enhances mutual understanding and trust among the G20 members. Since G20 is becoming more inclusive, so trust will increase among them. That is, I would say, a good step forward. I did not see anything negative in making African Union a member of G20. The cherry on the cake was African Union was made a permanent member under India's presidency. India advocated for it. No doubt about the fact that China's presence in Africa is above us or more than us, and it started before us also. Way back in 2000s, it started. We were late, no doubt about this fact. But by this, we can at least, come at par with China. Because by this, we are able to win the hearts and minds of Africans. And when you're able to win the hearts and minds of any person, you'll be able to influence them in a better way. That person will look up to you in times of crisis, in times of any problems. And problems are immense in Africa. So India should keep the momentum going if it wants to counter others over there. In others, China is there, West is there, and in a good positive way. Humanitarian aspect should be considered at the top. We should not be greedy because they're already poor. They're already struggling in their lives. So we should give, or whatever actions we do in Africa in the time to come, we should do it with a human touch. That is actually what is required. And वैसे भी, our Prime Minister is saying that India is successful in, shifting the momentum from GDP centric to human centric. So we should carry on that human centric for Africa also. Now, declaration on Russia-Ukraine war. The Russia-Ukraine war, which started February 2022. More than 1 year, the war is still ongoing. Did any G20 summits happen since the war started before the Delhi G20 summit? Yes, one summit happened last year in Bali. Now that summit also talked about the Russia-Ukraine war, but the major highlight of the outcome paragraphs of that particular summit was condemnation of Russia. India did not do that, or our declaration did not do that. We took a very nuanced and balanced approach. We said that if we want to end the war, we should first stop condemning Russia. We should stop, condemning Russia on multilateral forums and public forums. We should highlight, or we should consider the sufferings of the people on both sides, Ukraine and Russia. Because when, war is there, it is ultimately the people who suffer the most. We also talked about not using nuclear weapons. These were some of the changes which we adopted in this year's summit as compared to last year's summit. Last year's adopted paragraphs were very short-lived. There was divergence soon after its adoption. But here, we have also forged a consensus in this year's, I would say, paragraphs which we have released on Russia-Ukraine war. I'm just hopeful that these paragraphs sustain. These paragraphs continue. So, the consensus arrived in the G20 New Delhi Declaration or New Delhi Leaders Declaration set the stage for diplomatic and political conversation on Russia-Ukraine war. Ukraine, which is supported by the West and G7 groupings, whereas Russia, which is supported by Beijing. Beijing means China, has forged a no limits friendship with Russia. In the last year's summit, both Russia and China, they said that this platform, the G20 platform, is not a platform for discussing strategic issues. War is a strategic issue. It is only for discussing economic issues. The Western countries said, due to the war, economies are being impacted. That is why we are discussing this. But they stood their ground and said, no, this is a strategic issue. This time in this year's summit, everyone agreed that economies are being impacted due to the war. Even, Russia and China agreed. Because we took a different path for approaching the same situation. What was the different path? We advocated for, stop to condemn Russia. Stop to blame Russia on the war. Ukraine is also responsible equally. If the war is extending for so long, it is not only due to Russia. It is because of Ukraine also. This was the different path which we took. So one of the G7 officials was saying, enables us to look ahead to what should be the solution for a just and lasting peace at the end of war in Ukraine. This particular declaration. It may be possible that it has shown a pathway. That if we walk on this way, maybe we could, arrive to a solution. Solution is obviously that end of the war. So, We need to look into that. What happened in the last year's G20 summit? It had recorded the positions of G7 countries who were condemning Russia on one side, and on the other hand, Russian position of unilateral sanctions. Russia was condemning the sanctions, the Western countries, the G7 countries had put on Russia. Russia said that, why alone I am being sanctioned? Ukraine is also fighting with me. Ukraine should also be sanctioned. So there was this conflict. Indian officials were actually, I would say, very much concerned about this thing, that if such kind of situation happens this year also, what we will do. We do not want any such kind of situation happening under our presidency. So we are one side we are promoting Vasudev Kutumukam, and on the other side this type of activities, if it happens, then this will lead to a lot of problems. Then West's formulation on the war's impact on the global economy. Western countries were saying that war has impacted economy and G20 is an economic forum, so we are discussing about it. Whereas on the other hand, the Russians and the Chinese stance was that G20 is an economic forum that does not discuss security issues or strategic issues. Now the two paras in Bali which were adopted were divisive and divergent, and hence they were not long-lived. Now what changed in the G20 2023 summit? Although I have explained you, but yes, we'll go point by point. We said that stop condemning Russian aggression against Ukraine, stop condemning Russia for it. It is Ukraine also which is equally responsible. So if you are condemning Russia, condemn Ukraine also, or don't condemn anyone. Besides this, or instead of condemning Russia, you should focus on the humans suffering. Humans on both the sides, on Russian side also, on Ukrainian side also. It is not like humans on Ukrainian side are only suffering. Sufferings are there on both the sides. So we should consider their, I would say, concerns. Then we also talked about this Black Sea grain deal. Black Sea grain deal we've already covered. It is basically a deal which was signed or which was adopted last year in July, where Russia removed the blockade it had created on 3 ports of Ukraine. The 3 ports of Ukraine from which Ukraine used to supply food grains to the world. Then in March this year, there was again another meeting in which Russia said, okay, for next 2 months I'm going to extend. But now Russia has again blockaded those ports of Ukraine. Here in G20, we agreed that this Black Sea grain deal should continue. Otherwise, food prices in the world, they will go up. And the global south, particularly the developing and underdeveloped countries, they will be impacted the most. It has been agreed to, but let's see how much time does Russia take to make that possible. Last time, this Black Sea grain deal was signed between Russia, Ukraine, brokered by Turkey and United Nations. Now, under our presidency, we have again talked about it. When this Black Sea grain deal is in shambles, Russia has withdrawn itself from the Black Sea grain deal. Let's see, it has agreed here in G20 summit. Let's see how soon does Russia makes that deal revive again. So, we'll wait and see on that. Then, no country should threaten to use nuclear bombs or nuclear weapons. This is something which is a big sigh of relief. So, these were, I would say, the paragraphs or the changes which were reached on the Russia-Ukraine war. The major, I would say, outcomes of the G20 summit with respect to the Russia-Ukraine war are no use of nuclear weapons, stop condemning Russia unilaterally. We should consider the impact of this on the people. And, Black Sea grain deal, all these things should be revived. So let's see how long does this go. Because in G20 nothing is, backed by law. It is nothing illegal if Russia does not revive the Black Sea Grain Deal despite of agreeing over here. We cannot sue Russia that you agreed in G20, we want to sue you. No, nothing like this. Let's see up to what extent we are able to influence all the people. And actually, with time, we'll come to know whether the document was an all consensus document adopted in New Delhi G20 summit or not. So this is it. We have completed the G20 series. G20 series comprised of 3 videos, 11th, 12th and 13th of September. And I will be meeting you tomorrow with some, very important news, which is, presently important for prelims, mains point of view. We'll be covering them in a holistic manner. You can also mention in the comment box what topic you want me to cover. If that will be, feasible, if that will be relevant from the exam point of view, I will definitely be covering that. And do share this video with your friends who are preparing. If you find this videos good, definitely do share them. Signing off for today. Keep studying, keep reading, keep revising and keep writing. Bye-bye. Jai Hind.